Hey there everyone, welcome to my Zanki Zero retrospective. For those of you that don't know, I recently beat Zanki Zero, and I know not a lot of people were actually tuning in, so let me actually start this as a review rather than a critique, and then we'll move into the problems with the game, after that. So, if you didn't watch the Let's Play or you lost interest, you just want to kind of know overall, without any sort of spoilers, how is the game doing? I'm here to tell you. And the way the game is doing is that basically, if you like dungeon crawlers, it is one of the best dungeon crawlers you will ever play. The plot is actually really solid and really good. It's got some issues, but frankly, it's probably got one of the best plots a dungeon crawler will ever see. The basic premise is that 8 individuals wake up on a deserted island. They have to forage for food, they have to build facilities, they have to make sure that they have enough supplies to get through, because if they start starving, they will start fading away, and if any of them die, they have a machine that can bring them back to life, but they can only be alive for 14 days at a time, or 12 days at a time, some amount of days at a time. As they, prosper and they go forward, they end up extend it slightly, but still not very long. So it's a very desolate and weird experience, and one that doesn't really apply to anything that we're used to. So it's an interesting premise that I've never seen explored in other types of media. The biggest discussion point, at least outside of the game, is that the game was rather heavily censored. I shouldn't say heavily. They removed a couple of things, but people that are just super anti-censorship for any reason, that's the end of the world to them. So what do I think about the censorship? Well, 2 things. One, just out of the bat, it doesn't bother me. What they end up removing was a couple of references and allusions to sexualization of minor characters, and I'm more or less okay with that not being in the game. Even more so, because it's something that the company opted to do for the American localization, because America is a lot more... Japan apparently is just okay with sexuality in general, even when it involves minors, and America really isn't. America takes a very negative view of over-sexualization, and is especially gets our back up when it comes to minors, and I agree with that, because I wouldn't have wanted to see that anyway. So, absolutely, relatively okay with that. It's tough, because I'm never a fan of censorship, but in terms of this specific type of censorship, I'm also absolutely not bothered by the fact that they did it, if that makes sense. The stuff they took out is stuff that I do not miss, and I kind of agree with not having been in there in the first place. A lot of people have some kind of bullshitty arguments about it, but it's like, but they're clones, it's not really a kid. It is a prepubescent character. I don't care if it's a 9,000-year-old dragon. The character is very obviously portrayed in a way that they are below the age of puberty. So, kind of don't give 2 craps about whether or not they're actually underage or not. For those of you that are wondering and may not know about this, all they actually removed, from what I've been able to find out, they removed one scene towards the beginning of the game where one of the characters shows you her X key while wearing a dress, and they kind of cropped the shot up so you don't actually see her underwear, because she's like 13. And then later, it's actually funny, I never even saw these scenes to begin with, so I definitely don't care about this being cut out, because in a normal playthrough you never see it regardless. But there's apparently, if you just sleep at the inn or sleep at the hotel a whole lot with the same characters, they will eventually get to know each other well enough that you'll have a romantic scene. And they basically just made it so that that scene would not trigger if either character was an adolescent. Or, I mean, not an adolescent, was below the age of an adolescent. You have to at least have hit puberty for that scene to trigger at all. It is funny, when I was looking through, there were a lot of people that were basically asking whether or not if people would go in and mod them back in, and the basic answer that they got, and frankly, people know this, is guys, it would be pretty easy to re-add the sprites and everything, but what's really hard is that they removed the trigger. So the scene will never prompt for it to happen. So no, we're not going to reverse engineer the entire game for a couple of, frankly, kind of pervy scenes. So yeah, that's what they changed. And let me talk a little bit about censorship in a kind of broader sense. And I know I said this during the playthrough, but again, I know some people may be watching this that didn't watch the playthrough. I am absolutely, eternally against government-enforced censorship or, like, platform-enforced censorship. If Sony or if Steam was coming in here and saying, no, you can't have that, take that out, we're not selling it with that in there, I'm kind of like, you know what, get a life. You know, shut up. Let the market decide. If something is in a game, I should be able to choose whether or not I want to play a game with that in it. I don't need you playing morality police and saying, no, that content is not allowed. You are not allowed to enjoy this. However, whenever it's the actual developer going in and saying, you know what, during the localization process, we decided that this is not something that will really fit the tone of our game when it comes to America, and so we're going to go ahead and remove it preemptively. I'm kind of fine with that, to be honest. You know, I'm like, no, they're the developer. They should absolutely be able to make that determination and decide, do they actually want this content to be in their game? And if the answer to that is no, they don't want that content to be in the game, well, then they have absolutely the right to take it out. I do understand the people that don't like censorship, but the funny thing is that their complaint is always that the developer's vision, you know, they want to play the game the way the developer intended it. And then when you point out the developer's the one that took it out and they intend it to not be in there anymore, then suddenly their developer's intention doesn't matter anymore. So it's a little bit of a, I'm like, your argument doesn't, you can't pick and choose when the developer's intent matters, guys. Secondly, now we're going to get into some like critique of the game itself. So if you're watching this and you haven't played the game, you just kind of want my thoughts of the game in general, that's it. Now I'm going to dive into the plot, because the plot, although I like it, there are some things to pick apart when it comes to the plot, and things I didn't really dig when it comes to the plot. Actually, you know what? Before I get to that, there is one more thing that now I've lost everyone. The biggest reason I think that I didn't like the game overall was that they very weirdly and very specifically kind of made this as a spiritual successor to the Danganronpa series. Even though they went a different method with it, this is very much hope-based instead of despair-based. It's still a group of, you know, young adults. Obviously, Danganronpa was high schoolers, but this is a group of young adults that are in an isolated situation where the rest of humanity has been destroyed, and there is a game being played for the future of the human race. But then they took that, and then they changed away from the visual novel format and went for a dungeon crawler format. Which is great, except that and I'm sure a lot of the Danganronpa fan base, don't give two craps about a visual novel format. I mean, sorry, we're used to visual novel format, we don't care about a dungeon crawler format. And so it kind of, it reminds me a little bit of Persona Dancing All Night, where it was like, oh hey, we decided to continue the Persona story into a rhythm game that none of you actually want to play. Or, sure, there are people that really like rhythm games, and I'm sure they got a kick out of that, but Persona was even worse about it, because they were actually continuing the story in a completely different format. Here, they're just making a game that is very similar and very thematically referring to a different series that is beloved and well-known, except that you're fundamentally changing the type of game, so you'll end up with a lot of people that will buy it and play it, even though they don't actually like that type of game. And I'm like, why didn't you just make it as a visual novel? It would have been a great visual novel. I would have loved it as a visual novel. So, what did I think about the specific stories? Overall, all of the Garage Kids, with the exception of Rio, their backstory was tragic but forgettable. I mean, it was always just, oh wow, these characters had shitty parents, and there's some sexual abuse type things going on. For not all of them, but for a lot of them, it was actually creepy how frequently there was sexual abuse in their backstories. Haruto had, you know, manipulating and using that woman and showing her picture and getting her killed. And then, of course, I don't remember all their names, but the Florist of Lust, you know, was picked on and, called. It was actually interesting because they referred to how she would sleep around easily and was called a whore, but then, like, her actual story had nothing to do with that whatsoever. Then, of course, there was... oh, god dang it. Why am I terrible? 1 second. Then there was Yuma. Yuma, of course, ended up sleeping with her dad, which was creepy as hell. Minamo really didn't, except that they did threaten that whenever they, like, captured her. And then, Zan didn't have any sexual abuse for him specifically, but obviously his sister-in-law and his mom, or, not mom, I forget who the other person was, but was sleeping with his dad, kind of against their will, but not really. So, yeah, not the best. I mean, not the best, but it was a little bit just eternally. It's like, okay, every story is not the same, but explores very similar themes, and after a while, you just get burned out on it. You're like, okay, yes, people are assholes, we get it, Jesus. And the other problem is that once you went through their story, it didn't really seem like the characters fundamentally changed. It was like, oh, okay, now they remember their past, and they're still the exact same guy they were before. And I kind of wish there had been, and I guess that was what the, like, bedroom scenes were supposed to do, was to get people to know each other better. But the problem I had with it is that, they were so completely missable, and the plot kind of just seemed kind of cobbled together and not all that memorable until you get to Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is when the plot comes alive and is amazing. And I have the same problem with it as I did with Ni no Kuni 2, where the first 75% of the game is, okay, well, not completely forgettable, because like I said, I really actually liked Ryo's story. Ryo's story was beautiful and amazing and tragic in a way that other ones weren't, where you find out that his greatest joy was actually based upon his greatest frustration and fear. It was sort of a safety valve he built for himself. Ryo's story was amazing. I really enjoyed it, but the other ones, not really. And then Chapter 7 and 8, when you actually found out what was going on, really kind of redeemed the game. Chapter 7 and 8 were very, very, very enjoyable, very, very interesting. The other thing that saved it to a certain degree, because I would have really disliked playing the first 6 chapters, except for Kurosuke, where he would show up, and my god, when I first saw that scene, that was really well done and really interesting. And to have, a creature that was stalking through the ruins, I mean, I was really interested where that was going. The Kurosuke scene was is the first really good and, like, breathtaking moment the game had for me, and I don't know that if I liked it, because it was frustrating and, oh my god, but it was well done, and I was impressed by it, is what I'm going to say. That said, now that I'm talking about Kurosuke, what the flying hell was going on with the whole Haruto looks exactly like Kurosuke thing? Because I remember I was thinking it was like a failed clone or something, and then no. Apparently, no. Haruto just happens to look exactly like Kurosuke. They're not related, and nothing more is ever said about that. Once we find out that Haruto is innocent and the actual traitor is Mamoru, that never gets brought up again, and I have no idea what it was doing in the game, other than just being a massive red herring in order to make us suspect Haruto was the murderer. And it just, like, I really feel like that's a missed opportunity, or something that it just feels like a massive, massive plot hole, where you set this thing up, and then all of a sudden, after you set it up and you've got the plot going in that direction, you just pull a, nope, it's actually Mamoru! Haruto was innocent all along. And then I'm like, yeah, but what about this thing you introduced? What caused that? And the game just has nothing to say. Sad day. The other thing, while we're on the topic, Mamoru. Am I supposed to be okay with Mamoru? Because I'm definitely not. Like, this whole thing is this, like, elaborate revenge plot against the Garage Kids. And why Like, when Mamoru was first introduced, he has this, he's like, well, no, these kids are just as victims as anyone else. And then he immediately forgets about the fact that he didn't want, he had objections, and commits himself wholeheartedly to this super involved revenge plot against them, even though he already acknowledged that they weren't to blame. Like, that doesn't make any freaking sense to me. It's definitely a very big, and I feel like intentional reversal of what you'd already established about Mamoru. And I'm not okay with him. Like, he basically tortured a bunch of kids because he missed his sister. Like, that's the end of his storyline, and it's really stupid. I don't understand why they would, like, if you're going to go down that line, then it's why show the fact that he's smart enough and he realizes they're innocent, and then again, once you say that one time, you drop the subject and never bring it up again? I don't understand. Speaking of the Garage Kids, the other thing that does not make sense and was not ever super well explained is, why was Yuma hanging out with the Garage Kids? She's like the only daughter of the richest asshole in Japan. What was she doing attending public school at all? And especially once public school is over, she just goes out to a garage and hangs out with some bums? Like, that seems completely unbelievable. I don't understand why that's a thing. And that's never really brought up, because the revelation about, like, everyone knowing each other as the Garage Kids when they were a kid happens after Yuma's chapter. So, I'm not at all okay, or, I shouldn't say okay, but I don't, that seems a complete betrayal of her character. And it's also, like, was everyone just going to the garage after school, and how long do they? I don't know. I do not know. And also apparently Mamoru would go there. Like, what nurse is just randomly going out and hanging out with, like, elementary school kids off school campus grounds and off the clock? Like, I feel like that's a really good way to get shanks, because people think you're a pedophile, which brings us back to what we talked about at the beginning of this game. The last thing to talk about is that they were too heavy-handed in laying the groundwork for a sequel, and I don't like it. Like, the ending was a super interesting downer with the whole breaking down of the machine, and I was really interested with where that was going. And then also they introduced another character, but they're not going to, like, actually say what happened. And then at the end, they, I guess, bring everyone back, because at the very, very end of the game, you see the counter go up to 3. And yeah, you'd be like, oh, that means Sachika had a kid. Okay, Sachika was, at that point, like, 9. She wasn't having any kid. Plus, even if she was, it wouldn't happen right after she met the guy. Like, there's a germination period, guys. I know science. Even though I'm pretty sure I used the wrong term for that. So, at the end, my conclusion to the game is that, obviously, yeah, the game has a lot of issues. There's a lot of problems that occur as you go through and play it. Biggest problems that I have are that, one, the game is just too flipping hard. Like, I'm glad they put in the difficulties, but it's like the sheer magnitude of how many enemies were present just made the game a chore to play through. And again, that may be because I didn't really like the game type, so that may not be the game's fault. But it just really did not feel enjoyable. Like, I'm sorry to be that blunt about it, but geez. Why are you making me do this, game thing? Stop it. The actual combat system was interesting. The boss fights I really enjoyed. With the exception, I do feel like the Kurosuke boss fight was a bit gimmicky. And it is weird that Kurosuke is so much better than the final boss. Like, the final boss you fought for real, him you had to run around and use gimmicks in order to kill. So, that was disappointing. But I do think Kurosuke was the coolest victory I ever had, because I was literally, like, on my last person. Oh my gosh, that was awful, but also cool. So that said, I'm glad I played it. I will never play it again, and it definitely is not going to be one of my best games of the year by any stretch of the imagination. But it still was. It's still a really. It's one of those things. It's like, whenever you read a book, and the book isn't necessarily well written, but it introduces some really interesting, some really unique ideas, and so you're like, you know what? Being exposed to the ideas was worth the journey. That's kind of how I feel about Zanki Zero. Like, it wasn't well executed necessarily. There were a lot of problems it had. But I'm still glad that, because I've never seen a game, set quite with this plot line. The whole idea of dying and coming back and having to reassemble, and I do like that the whole thing of Sin was a trick that Mamoru was played. Like, I didn't see that coming at all. That was really well done. And it's a much more mature game in terms of, like, theming, because they actually do have kind of relatively downer ending for a while, and they pull it off very well. So, well done on that respect. At the end of the day, I still feel like it would have been better as a visual novel, and I still feel like they should have been more clear about, or maybe had the characters get to know each other faster or something, because I saw a couple of scenes, and even where they were just becoming better friends, but nothing ever broke through. Like, their plot, their characters couldn't ever evolve because those scenes were optional. So because they were optional, they had to have the whole game go through with everyone being a default, like, personality with no real option to be anything else. But there we go. That's going to be one of the last things that's my summation. Should you play the game? If you like dungeon crawlers, yes. If not, probably not, because I don't think you'll actually enjoy the experience. If I have to give it a rating, where is it in terms of, is this going to be one of my worst games of the year? It could be, probably, because I do think, of the games I played this year, it is definitely in the bottom 5, though granted we do have another 5 months for things to push it out. It's not a bad game, but it definitely is one of the more disappointing games I've played. So, obviously, I'm glad I got to share it with you, I'm glad I had the experience, but, yeah. If there's a sequel, I'm going to wait a bit before I decide to play the sequel, because there's just a lot of with it. But, thank you for tuning in, thank you for watching, and we'll get back to your regular uploads tomorrow.